So undoubtedly, many of us have heard the expression, ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. What we may not know is that that actually was said by St. Jerome in a commentary that he wrote on the book of Isaiah, which I'm sure we all know is in the Old Testament. So Isaiah's point was kind of like saying, we only really understand what it is that Jesus has done and who it is that Jesus is to the degree that we understand all that's in the Old Testament, which is pointing towards him. That comes to my mind this morning as we're getting closer and closer to the great celebration of our life as Christians, the Holy Week, and then the beautiful celebration of Jesus' glorious and triumphant resurrection at Easter. In a particular way, my encouragement to us, what I'm doing personally right now, is I'm just diving into the letter to the Hebrews. It's often called Paul's letter to the Hebrews, kind of funny because there's three things we know about this. Paul didn't write it, it's not a letter, and it's not to the Hebrews. What it really is something like an extended homily. It's a long homily. You think we preach long now? Read Hebrews. It's a long homily on the priesthood of Jesus. It's the only book in the New Testament which talks about Jesus as a priest. But he's the fulfillment of all the priests in the Old Testament. And so what I'm trying to do right now personally, and what I'm kind of encouraging us to do as we prepare for a more maybe awe-inspired Holy Week, is to read, it would be reading chapters 8, 9, and 10 of Hebrews. I would end with chapter 10, verse 25. So 8, 9, and 10, which talks about how Jesus is this mediator of a new covenant, and then it talks about how when God gives instructions to Moses in the Old Testament about the construction of the tabernacle or the tent of meeting or the dwelling which had inside it the Holy of Holies, all of that was done, according to the letter to the Hebrews, according to the pattern of what's in heaven. So in other words, you've got Moses is brought up on the mountain. God gives him instructions, build this dwelling. This dwelling is built according to the blueprint, if you will, that God allows Moses to see of what exists in heaven. So that's one thing that's going on in the Old Testament. And in this now are all these instructions on celebrations, most especially for what's known as the Day of Atonement, when once a year the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies and he would offer a sacrifice on behalf of the people. But the letter to the Hebrews makes clear in this kind of a sacrifice, when you're taking a bull and you slaughter it and you take the blood and you throw it all over people, that's not going to do anything for me. You can throw blood of an animal all over me. It's not going to change me. But it was a type. Types are really important for understanding Scripture. So types are people, places, events, things in the Old Testament which help us better understand people, places, things, events in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, you have this Day of Atonement, you have this tabernacle, you have this Holy of Holies, you have all these things and feasts which are all supposed to help point us towards what it is that Jesus has done. So for example, the Holy of Holies, which once a year the high priest would enter into and pray on behalf of the people of God. Nobody could ever get into. Nobody, ever. In fact, they tied a rope around the high priest in case he died, then they'd pull him out so that nobody would have to go in and get him. Well, when Jesus is on the cross and the soldier pierces his side, his heart, and the blood and the water flow out, what's the point of that? Well, one of the points of that is the real Holy of Holies is the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which has been ripped open. So remember when Jesus dies, it talks about how the veil was torn. What's the veil? The veil is the veil that separated the Holy of Holies in the temple from the rest of the temple. In other words, now everybody has access to the Holy of Holies. How do I have access to God? I have access to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which out of his great love has gone to the cross for me and now made it possible for me to enter into God's courts. In other words, I have access to God now. You have access to God. In the Old Testament, that was unthinkable. Nobody had access to God, only the priest on behalf of the people. So, long way of saying, try in these days ahead, wrestle with, grapple with, stumble through, doesn't matter. Just do everything we can to try to not only read Hebrews 8, 9, 10 up to verse 25, but try to wrestle with Exodus chapters 25, 26, and 27, where it talks about the Ark of the Covenant, which is something which existed long before Harrison Ford's Raiders of the Lost Ark, but that's the Ark they're talking about. So it talks about the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the construction of the tabernacle, everything that goes into it. And then also read Leviticus chapter 16, which is the instructions for the Day of Atonement. Ignorance of Scripture, ignorance of Christ. The more we can kind of grasp what it is that God instructed the people in the Old Testament to do, the better we're going to be able to understand what it is that Jesus has done. It's okay if we sit here at times and we just go, I don't understand this. But the more we try to wrestle with it, the better off we're going to be. And maybe a last thing that might be helpful, it's helpful for me anyway, see if you can find, you can do this online easily, right? See if you can find an image, like a drawing, of what the tent of meeting looked like in the Old Testament. So just, Google images or Bing or do whatever, like the dwelling that Moses created, images, and see, so that you can see how it was laid out, what are all these things, and then as you're looking at that and you're reading both Exodus and Leviticus, then read Hebrews and just see how Jesus is fulfilling everything that we're reading about in the Old Testament, all culminating in the fact that because he, the great high priest, has brought not a bull but himself, allowed himself to be slaughtered, he doesn't sprinkle his blood on me. He gives it to me to drink so that I can be transformed and you can be transformed and we can become holy. So as the time gets kind of crazier and crazier out there, spring's coming, it's really exciting. We're all thrilled here in Michigan because it's over 50 and we think it's August. Try to slow down spiritually and interiorly and push out distractions and just concentrate on the passion, but through the lens of Hebrews in the Old Testament, and let's ask God for the gift of awe as we ponder more profoundly what it is that he in his great love has done for us. Peace.